Hello and welcome to Loving Our Fears with Shikha Rastogi. It was the end of March and more than a year had passed since then. As an empath, I had already been feeling the pain and suffering, the frustrations and desperations of people around the world. But all those feelings began to get magnified in my body when COVID hit close to home. And around the end of March, the first member of my family back in India got tested positive for COVID. Then a few days later, I found out that my mom had also tested positive, followed by my dad, who ended up having a very close call. As the situation with my parents continued to unfold, each day I would also receive news about more deaths in my own family or my friends' families back in India, and would get to know about people who had tested positive and were suffering. Although I have never experienced what it's like to live in a war zone, however, at the time, the situation in India felt so much like a war zone, and the news that was of India was depressing and relentless. Each day felt like I was traveling in a long, dark tunnel, and although I was moving very quickly through this dark tunnel, because everything that was happening back home was happening very fast. However, I couldn't really see any light at the end of this tunnel. And this is when fear started to rear its head and started to show up in my body again. But it wasn't until that night when my father's oxygen levels started to gradually drop, and my sister and I, from long distance, started to frantically try to find oxygen and a nurse to hook up that oxygen to keep our father alive at home, so that it would buy us some time to find a hospital with a vacant bed, is when fear struck like a bolt of lightning. And even though the feeling of fear was nothing new to me, because I've had a very long relationship with fear, where over the years, instead of unsuccessfully fighting with my fears, I changed my approach and began learning to welcome it into my body and learning how to allow myself to finally feel it as much as I possibly could. I had also been practicing viewing my fears as a neglected and needy kid that needed my love and attention. And this change in approach was working for me, because I would feel deeply peaceful for no reason a lot of the time. But that fateful night, when fear had me in its grips, as I kept calling phone numbers one after another and continued talking to people, sometimes even black marketers, in hopes that I would find an oxygen concentrator or an oxygen, my entire body kept shaking. But because I was constantly on the phone and firmly in the grip of fear, I wasn't able to practice anything which I had been learning over the years, including breathing deeply, because I was finding it very difficult to even breathe, let alone breathe deeply. As moments stretched into hours, I noticed that my body was trying to cope in the best way it possibly could, given that I couldn't do anything to consciously intervene at that time. But I noticed something else, and that was because I was so busy on the phone, my mind was completely distracted and was totally out of the way, and as a result, I wasn't really resisting all the uncomfortable sensations I was feeling in my body because of the fear. Somehow, unconsciously, I was completely allowing fear into my body without any resistance. And in those moments, it's that this is exactly what I had been learning to do all these years, to invite fear into my body and allow myself to feel the very uncomfortable sensations without resistance. To allow fear to pass through my body, to stop fighting with my fears and demanding them to leave me alone by resisting them. In those moments of crisis, I showed up without the armor of resistance and allowed fear to do whatever it needed to do and pass through my body. And isn't this exactly what we as a society are trying to collectively learn? To drop our own armors of resistance and trust the process of allowing ourselves to feel our so-called negative feelings. But have you ever wondered, why is it so easy for us to resist and so hard to allow ourselves to feel fear or any other negative feeling, especially when so many years of research has confirmed that resisting only strengthens the fear? To better understand, you have to travel back in time and remember those days when you were a baby or a kid, and when you would get hurt, your parents or caregivers would want you to stop. What your parents and caregivers were unconsciously teaching you at the time was that letting yourself cry through your pain was a bad thing and it needed to be stopped. You were learning in those moments that to start feeling better, you needed to stop feeling the pain. You were learning how important it was to start feeling better sooner and faster. So, over time, your mind ended up creating mechanisms to run away from the pain instead of embracing it and walking through it with it. But as long as we show up armed with resistance to our pain and suffering, we will end up in a battle with our own negative feelings. So the trick is to unlearn and retrain our minds. The trick is to accept pain and suffering as part of life and living, and not something which is bad and necessary to eradicate. And until we learn, we will continue down the same path with the exact same experiences as the last time. So the question is, are you ready to try dropping your resistance armor yet?